Hello and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and I'm really excited to have my guest today and the content that we're going to talk about, which is always fascinating. I do have a bit of a warning to give at the beginning, which is that maybe it's because we're doing it a bit earlier, and maybe all the kids are coming home from school in the UK at the moment. Everyone's spamming the internet, so my internet is a bit weaker, or far weaker than it normally is. And I know sometimes I have problems, but this is particularly dodgy. So I hope it's all right for this interview, because I'm really excited to welcome John Wathey, who is a neuroscientist who has just released the second book. And originally I was going to talk about both books in this interview, but I thought there's so much content to the first book when I was going through it that I thought I've got no chance of A, reading the second book, and B, being able to deal with both sets of contents within this interview. So we're going to split this over two interviews, which is great. So we're going to talk about John Wathey's first book. But before we get on to that book, welcome, John, to the channel. So first of all, welcome.
My pleasure. I'm honored to be here.
And do you want to give the watchers, the listeners, a little bit of a bio into who you are, what your work has been, what your interests have been, and that may have sort of obviously led towards you writing the books you have?
Sure. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist by training. I'm also by profession a computer nerd, a computer programmer. I love computational work. I'm retired now, but my interest in religion goes all the way back to when I was doing my PhD research. I did my PhD in the lab of Ted Bullock at the Department of Neurosciences here in San Diego. And he is widely regarded in the field anyway as one of the founding fathers of what's called neuroethology. And his approach to understanding behavior had a deep impression, a deep effect in how I see living things, including humans. The big idea behind neuroethology is, well, first, to explain it, I have to split off the neuro prefix and just talk about ethology, which is the science of behavior in its natural context. Ethologists are interested in how a behavior evolves and what purpose it serves in the reproductive success of the animal. And famous examples of it are Konrad Lorenz's work on imprinting in birds, Nico Tinbergen's studies of the herring gull chick behavior. The idea of neuroethology, if you put the neuro in front of it, is a broader project and in some ways more specific also. The thinking behind neuroethology is that the brain is so complicated that the only hope we have of understanding it is to find some circuit in the brain, some part of a brain, where we completely understand what problem it's trying to solve. And our best hope of doing that is to look into the brains of animals that are highly specialized for a behavior that has been very well studied, thoroughly understood by ethologists. And then at that point, we're in a much better position to go into the brain and try to figure out how the neurons actually solve that problem. So to give you just a few specific examples, the ability of a barn owl to hunt in total darkness using only sound cues, or the development of song in birds and in songbirds, the development of singing in songbirds. Also, the ability of weakly electric fish to navigate and communicate with one another using electric fields, using weak electric fields.
But I guess the difficulty here is trying to get an owl in the night in an MRI scanner, or
yes.
I mean?
Now, that's a great question you just asked. It raises an important point about neuroethology. You want not only a behavior that's well understood, you want a behavior that can be in some way simulated in the lab, replicated in the lab, without having the animal actually doing the behavior. So in the case of a barn owl, for example, when you're exploring how it localizes sound in space, you can put little headphones or earphones on the barn owl, which is not flying around trying to catch a mouse. But with these headphones on, you can change the timing, the very precise timing of signals that you present to both ears. And the difference in timing is one of the critical cues to where in space the sound is coming from. So that's the trick. And similarly with navigating and using electric fields for the weakly electric fish, you can place objects in the water that simulate things the fish has to navigate around, and you can manipulate the electric field that's in the water either by sort of disconnecting the electric organ using drugs. So the fish is thinking that it's generating an electric field, but you are artificially generating it using electrodes, and so you can kind of trick the fish into seeing an electric field that's different from the one he's trying to make. And those are the kind of clever tricks that neuroethologists use to try to figure out what's going on in the brain.
That reminds me of transcortical magnetic stimulation, is it? Where you can affect the human brain in its moral judgments, even, I think some research shows. So by giving a magnetic stimulation to the brain, you can literally change how someone morally rationalizes, which is, then you can talk about, well, what supervenes on what? Does our rational mind control our body, or does the body control the mind? And is that kind of an afterthought? So is our rationalization actually the end result of the machinations of the brain? But anyway, I digress.
Yes, and that's a good point, and we'll probably get into that subject in more detail in our second interview. But getting back to this first question of how I got interested in religion and how I think about it scientifically, it's this neuroethological background that I've been describing that is my lens onto religion, human religious behavior, and that's how I see and think about religion. And that started decades ago, long before I ever started writing about it.
So, okay, let's rewind. So before you got into academia and following a desire to understand the world and do science, what was your sort of childhood background in terms of, I quite often say that my assumptions of most Americans is that they are born and brought up in religious households, although that's a changing demographic now. But was that the case for yourself? And what led you away from religion?
Yes, that was the case for me. Both of my parents took religion very seriously. They attended church. They're Christians. They attended church every week. There was one thing unusual about my religious background, though. My parents were not of the same flavor of Christianity. My mom was a Catholic. My father was a Protestant, Presbyterian. And usually the Catholic Church doesn't condone a mixed marriage. Back then, they cared a lot more about it, I guess, than they do now. But back then, this was in the 1940s when my folks got married. They wanted, if a Catholic was going to marry a non-Catholic, they wanted all the children to be raised as Catholics, and they would sort of endorse the religion, endorse the marriage, or allow the marriage to take place in the Catholic Church if the couple agreed to that. My parents bent that rule a little bit and decided to have one of their children be raised a Protestant so that my dad wouldn't have to go to church alone. And I was that one child out of 4 siblings who was raised a Presbyterian. My siblings were raised Catholic and went to church with my mother. So my connection to religion from family is more closely tied to my dad than to my mom, but both of my parents were very religious.
Did that manifest itself differently for you as opposed to your 3 siblings? Like, did you have any, like the fact that you were indoctrinated or I don't want to be so sinister, but you were introduced to Protestantism as opposed to Catholicism. Do you think that made any meaningful difference?
I think it might have to some extent. In one way, back then, a lot of the masses, we're talking about 1950s, early 1960s, a lot of the masses in Catholic churches were still being conducted in Latin. So for a kid to go there and sit through a Latin mass it was just gibberish. It didn't make any sense. And I did occasionally go to church with my mother. Usually, I guess those were times when my dad was out of town on business trips or something, and I would go to church with my mom. And so I would occasionally get to see what a Catholic Mass is like. And the ceremony is just radically different. The incantations, the kneeling, the genuflecting, the candles all over the place. Even as a kid, I could appreciate there were big differences. And I think that started to put a little bit of chink in the armor of religion for me. I could see that not all religions believe exactly the same thing, and they contradict each other in some ways. And especially as I got into high school and started learning about other religions than Christianity, that just became a really obvious weakness in the whole idea of religion. There are so many mutually contradictory religions. They can't all possibly be right because they contradict one another. And maybe the most reasonable conclusion is that none of them are true. So that's sort of how my apostasy started.
And then how did you start getting into the love of science and trying to understand the world in the way that you have done?
That I also attribute largely to my dad. He was a chemist by profession, and he loved science himself. He subscribed to some sort of sciencey magazines and newspapers and things like that. He read popular science books. I vividly remember when I was a little kid seeing a book on a nightstand when I was just barely old enough to be able to read the title of it. The title of the book was Satellite with an exclamation mark after it. This was written around the time of Sputnik, late 1950s. The space race was just getting started. Space exploration was a big thing in the news. It was fascinating to me. I was absolutely enthralled with the idea of exploring, going to some place no one's been, seeing something new, walking on the moon. I lived through all of that. It was just a stunning thing. And so
Wow.
I was just drawn to it. I loved it.
And do you think it was that kind of love of understanding the cosmos, which is understanding reality, which is understanding the world, was an influence in you wanting to understand, ethology, behavior of humans in this?
Yes.
And then when did that interest in understanding how religion came about? How did that develop particularly?
Well, it's interesting that that I brought up the subject of space exploration because it was right about the time of the Apollo 11 moon landing, just a couple of months before, that I had kind of a split with my parents over religion. That was when I came out to them as being not a Christian. I wasn't calling myself an atheist yet, but
what age was this?
I was almost 16 years old, not quite
Right.
16 years old, and still going to high school, and still going to church with my dad every Sunday morning. And I was just feeling that by doing so, I was being a hypocrite. I was pretending to be something I wasn't. I didn't believe it anymore. I knew Christianity, there was something seriously wrong with Christian theology. It can't possibly be right. I wasn't quite sure whether or not there existed any kind of God, but I felt that I was being dishonest by going to church. And I felt that my dad had always raised me to value honesty as an important virtue. And that's kind of how I approached it with him. And at first he was accepting of the idea that I should, make these decisions and think for myself. And as the next Sunday approached, which by coincidence was Easter Sunday that year, he got very upset that I wasn't going to church with him. And angry words were exchanged. And there was just, after that time, they didn't kick me out of the house or anything like that. We still got along. But there was always this gulf between us about religion. They were never fully accepting of the fact that I didn't believe in God. So I think that's where I seriously got interested in, okay, so I understand that religion is mistaken somehow, but why is it so appealing? Why are so many people so deeply enmeshed in it, captivated by it? What explains this powerful grip it has on the human mind? That's sort of what triggered my scientific interest in it.
And what's interesting about your book, and I'll just bring that up here, this is your first book, which is The Illusion of God's Presence, the Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing. So what's particularly interesting about that is actually it's sort of, you're not just regurgitating other theories and just saying, look, this is why people believe, but this is actually, you're presenting your own theory of belief, a neonatal theory of some of the roots of the belief in a way that I think in a way that's original, and therefore that's pretty impressive actually, because we live in a society these days where everyone's already said everything that needs to be said. Do you know what I mean? Well,
Yes.
I feel like whenever I think I've had an original thought, some Greek philosophers had it 3,000 years before, and I'm just really late to the party. But am I right in saying that it's broadly an original theory at the base of what you say? I mean, you say an awful lot in the book, but a lot of what you say.
You're not I guess I have to say, cast all modesty aside and say, yes, I agree with that. You're not the first person to say that. One other commentator on religion I admire greatly is Robert Lawrence Kuhn, who's
Right.
done a lot of interviews on the
Closer to
philosophy
truth.
of religion. Yes, you know it. So
It's such an amazing resource. Yeah.
yeah, I really enjoy his work. He's read my second book and basically said what you just said, that there is something novel here, that and that's kind of rare in the science of understanding religion. But I do want to quickly, while we're talking about originality, give some tribute to the shoulders I stand on, which are vast and impressive. The work of Lee Kirkpatrick, especially, I have to comment on in this context. He's a psychologist. I think he's retired now. I'm not sure, but he's been at the University of Virginia in recent years, I think, or in College of William and Mary, I think it is. Back in the 1990s, he started a research project trying to understand some aspects of religion in terms of the attachment theories of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And so he's developed what's called the attachment theory of religion. And the idea there is that God can be seen as an attachment figure in the sense defined by John Bowlby way back in the 1950s, trying to understand child development in humans. And there the idea is that there's this secure base that the parent, especially the mother, most often the mother, but either parent, is an attachment figure that gives the child security, nourishment, protection, safety, but also functions as a secure base from which the child can venture and explore and branch out and gradually learn to become an autonomous human being. And so he's based his theory of religion on that, and it deals with there's a lot of overlap between his ideas and mine, dealing with the sort of infantile dimension of religion, the infantile aspects of the way we see God,
which we'll come on to. I mean, it's interesting. Attachment theory has become really in vogue again in the UK, particularly in education. It's, you know, and where we find lots of damaged children, you know, attachment issues are often at the basis of that. But I guess we're going to come on to talk about maladaptive, sort of the way that evolution can misfire, or however you want to interpret that. But before we get there, I suppose what we're starting with is finding out the causality of behavior and beliefs. So, you know, much of your writing's about finding out why we believe from a causal point of view. And you list, you say there's a big list of a load of different sort of causal factors, but 7 of them are particularly important for spirituality. And these are initiative from within the self, response from beyond, prayers answered, the sense of security, sense of joy, the sense of presence, the sense of certainty, the sense of purpose or new meaning to life as a consequence of experience, and the experience triggered by despair. So these are 7 sort of areas that are really important. Do you want to say anything to those 7? I know that's an awful lot of stuff to talk about, but
sure. It's a good place to start. First, I should say that list comes from a book written by Alistair Hardy, who was a marine biologist in the UK, as a fellow of the Royal Society back in the 20th century. He became interested in religion because of what he described as something that he started experiencing these spiritual experiences in his childhood as a boy, just wandering around in nature, exploring living things, collecting beetles and butterflies and flowers and stuff like that. And every once in a while, he would have this feeling that would come over him, which he described as partly within himself and partly from outside of himself, a feeling of the presence of some being, some loving, nurturing being that made nature, that created the world and made this experience of nature possible for him. And it was a personal thing he was experiencing, something toward which he felt love and gratitude. And he described it as feeling a sense of presence, that this other being was, like I said, within himself, but also outside of himself, there somehow. He always put it in these vague terms. He didn't put it in terms of any specific religious doctrine or any organized religion. It was just this feeling. So he was so intrigued by this that in his later years, after he retired from academia, he published a request in the British media soliciting similar experiences from people. And he got thousands of them. Not all of them, of course, like his. There are a wide variety, some of them not even specifically religious, more psychic experiences and things like that. But he and some of his collaborators just went through them and tried to categorize them, and had a lot of difficulty doing that. And so instead what they did was to just identify common attributes that often showed up in these experiences that people report. And the ones you just listed, those 7 are the top 7. Those are the 7 most common that he found. So most of them can fairly easily be seen as having something to do, I think, with the feelings that an infant would have toward its mother, toward its attachment figure. Feelings of security, feeling of the presence of this other being, this other nurturing being, feelings of safety. I forget. I don't have the list in front of me. I can't.
Well, I was just, yeah, you're absolutely right. Joy, presence, certainty, purpose, or new meaning to life. Experience triggered by despair, i.e., the maternal figure would come in and solve that despair for you.
Right, exactly. Despair is separation. Yes, exactly.
The idea of certainty is really interesting. I don't know if this is particularly relevant, but I quite often have these conversations with people where you talk about your parents and you say, I can kind of remember when I first realized when my parents didn't know everything, and like I might know a bit more than my parents and might have better, more accurate understanding of reality, or whatever it is. And there's at some point where we all recognize that our parents are just human beings, right? Whereas actually, and I think this is really, I've just been thinking about this a little bit because I have that conversation quite often. But now, in terms of what your work says, I now think, wow. So in the sense that I maybe grew up thinking in a, maybe, I don't know, that my parents are kind of omniscient and omnipotent in a way that we ascribe to a god. Our parents have a kind of godlike position if you have a good relationship with them, that is. And there are loads of variables going on there, and that actually seems to fit in with what you're saying in your work.
Yes, exactly. And I take it back in time. Now this is somewhat speculative, but I take that back in time all the way to birth, or even before birth, when the nervous system is developing in the fetus. That a human infant has an innate expectation of the existence of its mother. And again, this is not a specific image of a specific person, but it's the vague expectation that there exists this primordial savior out there somewhere who can nurture you, feed you, keep you warm, protect you, love you, respond to your needs, respond to your crying, and you must connect with that being. It's an imperative. That being certainly exists. You must connect with it, and your life depends on it. Now, I'm embellishing it with how an adult would think about it. To an infant, it's not in words. It's just feelings and intuitions and an expectation of existence.
It's such an interesting. I mean, attachment is obviously incredibly pertinent. I understand that's the shoulders upon which you are standing, attachment theory. But it really does seem very plausible that the God figure and the maternal, or at least primary caregiver figure, are one and the same. We often talk about God as a comfort blanket in terms of, times of despair, or just, wanting that presence, almost like a constant friend, a constant loving presence there. So yeah, it certainly seems to fit. Of course, what the theist could say back, John, that because we understand the evolutionary and biological causal factors that explain belief, it doesn't mean that the belief is not true. I don't know if you would have anything to say to that.
I've heard that argument before, and strictly speaking, I can't refute it or say that there is no God. It's entirely possible, and you have people like Francis Collins, who, for example, a distinguished scientist, who happens also to be a Christian and has written about his belief in God. He also attributes his belief, or offers as evidence for the existence of God, this feeling of God's presence, what he calls a God-shaped vacuum in the human heart and mind. Why he offers it as a rhetorical question. Why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled by God? So he would argue that, sure, the evolution may have shaped the human mind to be more receptive to these kinds of beliefs, and maybe that's because God wants it that way, and God does exist, and it's his way of connecting with us. So I won't try to dispute that, strictly speaking, but I would put it this way: for as long as humans have existed, we've tended to attribute to supernatural beings anything we don't understand. Where does lightning and thunder come from? Well, it's because the gods are angry. It's Thor's hammer. We just invent these things to explain, and I put the word explain in quotes, what we don't understand. Now, from a scientific point of view, these things are not explanations at all. They don't count as explanations because they're untestable. They make no predictions. They suggest no experiments. How would you disprove Francis Collins' assertion that we feel God's presence because God made our brains such that we would feel his presence? I don't know how to test that.
Classically unfalsifiable. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I always like the analogy. I think Richard Carrier first used this. The talk about thunder and lightning. We can now explain that through the understanding of meteorology and so on and so forth. Naturalism has supplanted supernaturalism 10,000 times as an explanation for any given phenomenon, and yet supernaturalism has never once supplanted naturalism. So when you're talking about the things that we don't quite understand yet, consciousness, the origins of the universe, are you going to bet on a horse that has lost 10,000 times in a row, or are you going to bet on a horse that's won 10,000 times in a row? And actually, the horse with form is the naturalism horse, and so therefore you've got good inductive reason to think that naturalism is a better explanation.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and that's exactly the point I'm trying to make.
So,
So this feeling, and I would only add that this feeling of God's presence is along with many other aspects of human consciousness, but this feeling of God's presence is one of the most recalcitrant holes or gaps in our knowledge, where the God of the gaps still lives. There are very few educated people today still believe that thunder and lightning come from Thor's hammer, but many, including Francis Collins and Alistair Hardy, when he was alive, believed that this feeling of God's presence comes from something supernatural.
Which I think that in one of your talks you showed on your slideshow, you showed a slide, a graph of, this is the average person in America, say the percentage of people who believe in God, and then it's like the percentage of scientists who believe in God, and then the percentage of eminent scientists who believe in God, which then drops way down to 7%, I think.
Yes.
But then you make a very interesting point about that, because Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think, was talking about this maybe in Cosmos, or I don't know, in somewhere, and you were saying, actually, here's a question you should have been asking.
Yes, and Neil deGrasse Tyson is the one who pointed this out, and the question he asked is the question he pointed out is. What's interesting about this is not that the percentage of eminent scientists who believe in God is so low. The interesting question is, why is that number not zero? Why do any of them believe in a personal God who answers prayer? And Neil's response to that, or he didn't have an answer to that. He just said that this is a big mystery here. There's something going on that nobody seems to be talking about. That's the way he put it. Those are pretty much the exact words he used. And what I have tried to do in my first book is basically answer that question. Why is it that these eminent scientists believe in God? And what I'm suggesting is that they have this belief because they've been fooled, they've been tricked, they've been seduced by a cognitively impenetrable illusion. And that illusion is the illusion of God's presence. And if I'm right about that, that makes some specific predictions about what kind of religiousness that 7% would have. The kind of religiousness that comes from this feeling of God's presence, these factors, that list of 7 from Alistair Hardy's research, tends to be a spirituality that sees God as unconditionally loving, nurturing, and distinctly not the kind of God who is judgmental, punishing, cruel, the God of hell and damnation. There's a dichotomy between these two dimensions of religiousness that I try to draw, and this feeling of God's presence, this illusion of God's presence, comes from just one of them, what I call the neonatal root of religion. So if I'm right about that, that's actually testable. You could survey eminent scientists for what kind of religiousness they have with a psychometric test, and that should show up in a dramatic way. And the only other point I'll add is that an alternative explanation for their religiousness is that, well, maybe they were just heavily indoctrinated as children, and therefore their religiousness lingered, and they're a residual 7% that just had the most religious indoctrination. That was actually examined in a study of Fellows of the Royal Society, an equally prestigious group of scientists. And the authors there commented that, surprisingly, there was no correlation between early childhood experience with religious upbringing and their adult feelings about the existence of God. And to me, that's not a surprise at all. That's exactly what I would predict, that it's not coming from indoctrination. It's coming from something intrinsic to human nature.
I was looking at a Royal Society paper this morning because I was quoting from it or referencing it in a chapter I'm writing for a book I'm writing at the moment. But it was interesting because he was talking about causality of belief, and again, scientists believe less, but psychologists, believe even less. It's like, so people who understand why we believe end up realizing, well, you're thinking about, well, you believe because of that, not because of the religious content, because of the functional benefits that this religious belief brings to you. So therefore, once you understand why people believe, you start that kind of, the whole magic of it falls away, and you see it as a functional thing.
Yes.
I guess what would so do you want to sketch out then the basis of your neonatal sort of theory of the development of this illusion?
Sure. What I'm suggesting is, and I should say that what I'm about to describe really does fit a pattern that comes from neuroethology. One of the common observations in ethological studies and neuroethological studies is that these complex, highly specialized behaviors, like singing in songbirds, for example, they almost always have some innate component to them. There's some innate, in the case of songbirds, there's an innate drive to sing, and there is some innate coding in the brain for the song itself. But that encoding is not complete. It's a crude, rough model of what the song should be. And if you raise a songbird in isolation from its parents and it never hears an adult singing, it will go on to develop song and it will sing, but it will be an abnormal song, crude and simplified. And from one individual to another, there's quite a bit of variation in what kind of song they come up with. But what I'm suggesting about human religiousness is that there's something like that going on, that we have some innate circuitry that directs us to believe in the existence of and form an attachment to this figure, this attachment figure that will save us and nurture us and protect us, feed us, and so on. And that life depends on that connection. Part of that is innate, and it's just a vague sense of the existence of this being that exists, that understands your needs, knows your needs, is able to meet your needs, and is willing to, as long as you cry out for help. And that crude model of a mother, now there's a little bit more to it than that. Of course, there's physiological aspects to it, like the mother provides nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste, things like that. But the essential idea is that this persists into adulthood. The circuitry that does this persists into adulthood in sort of a dormant state. It rarely gets used anymore. But to make innate circuitry like this, to wire up the brain in sort of a hardwired way, seems to require non-modifiable synapses. The brain has to do this in a way that can't easily be changed through experience.
Which is to say that there are parts of the brain that if they were damaged, you would be in trouble, because you wouldn't be able to do that, because actually they can't either be modified themselves, or other parts of the brain can't fulfill the functions of the part that gets damaged, which is how you know that this is a kind of a really hardwired thing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the idea. And we see examples of that elsewhere. A good example I often talk about is in face perception. Humans are extremely good at recognizing subtle differences in faces and learning to recognize thousands of different faces. But that learning is a highly specialized thing. And it takes place in an area that we've now identified in the brain called the fusiform face area. And if you damage that area by a stroke, for example, then you lose the ability to recognize faces. Even if you're shown a picture of your spouse, a close family member, a famous person, you can no longer distinguish who they are. You can tell you're looking at a face, but you can't tell whose face it is. And that syndrome is most severe, and it happens even if the damage occurs in a newborn infant. There is one case in the neurological literature of that. And amazingly, no other part of the cortex in that patient could learn to take over the lost function of the fusiform face area. Even though in other areas of cortex, we often see that. You can damage a whole lot of speech cortex, for example. If that damage happens in infancy or early childhood, other parts of the cortex will learn to take over that function and speech will develop. But for face recognition, that it doesn't work. You really need that a certain amount of innate knowledge, innate wiring in that area to be able to learn to recognize faces. Now, of course, the irony there, or seeming paradox, is that what this thing does is learning. It's extremely plastic. Most of what it does is learning. But because it's such a highly specialized kind of learning, the brain has implemented restrictions in it, certain hardwired expectations. For example, one of them is that faces are going to be upright. And even without any kind of damage to your brain, you're much better at recognizing and distinguishing upright human faces than upside down faces. So the brain is taking shortcuts.
There's that image you showed with Margaret Thatcher with her eyes upside down, with her upside down, but the eyes are right way, and it messes with your brain, and so. I had a friend who had face blindness, and it was a fascinating thing that he'd say. I mean, I've met him 20 times or whatever, but he'd say, I remind you, I know you from other cues, just not your face. And it's interesting. Like, I think everyone must exist on the spectrum somewhere. Like, we're good at, in the same way that, you can be good at sport or good at this or good at that from whatever causal factors. I am really, this sounds conceited, but I'm really good at recognizing faces. So we'll be watching films at home, movies at home, and I'll say, oh, that's Jim Smith from this program, from that. And, IMDb brain, sort of international movie database for a brain. And I'm just like, yeah, I know that. But my partner will not recognize people on movies and films, and it's really interesting. She just has a very poor, I mean, she's great with dates and I'm rubbish with dates, but it just happens with faces on the screen. I don't know if that's in real life, but on the screen she really struggles knowing that that's someone from there. One of our children, we got twins, one of our children is definitely really good at recognizing faces because he's always doing it as a 12-year-old. But yes, anyway, that's a rabbit hole. I thought it was quite interesting.
No, I'm glad you brought it up, though, because you brought up one important point that probably deserves mention. You mentioned twins and face perception and the variation across people, across individuals in face perception ability. This is one of the ways we can get a handle on the extent to which something comes from genetic factors. If identical twins, if you do a study of both identical and fraternal twins, and you find that identical twins are significantly more alike in their face perception ability than are fraternal twins, then you've shown that there is a genetic component to it. Because identical twins share 100% of their genes, and fraternal twins only 50% on average. So that's strong evidence for genetic contribution. And that, in fact, that study has been done, and roughly a third of the variance in face perception ability comes from genetic factors.
Right, interesting.
And now getting back to religion, you can do a twin study of that. You can do a twin study of religiousness, and if you do it, you have to be careful to do it in adult subjects, because the religiousness of children and young adolescents is so heavily controlled by parents, and family, environment. But if you do this in adult subjects, you find that roughly half of the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors.
Which is, and people like Dean Hamer got into trouble, well, not into trouble, but he was lambasted for saying there's a God gene. But the idea is there are genetic components, is misrepresented, but there are genetic components for, as you would expect, and then this is, ethology, which is like if you accept that behaviors are genetically determined to at least some degree, right, then religious behavior is just another behavior. Belief is just another behavior. So why wouldn't it be in some way dictated, your spirituality in some way determined by your genetic makeup? I mean, it's for me, it's just blindingly obvious. But
yeah. And what I've just tried to do is to to give some kind of evolutionary rationale and understanding behind that, which has to do with selective pressures for the survival of helpless human infants. Human infants are born, completely altricial, completely helpless. We absolutely do depend on another being out there to save us when we're newborn infants.
So you talk a little bit about face blindness to say that certain things are hardwired into us, so that when we're born, we're just that. I mean, there's other examples you give about the gull pecking a beak, or a herring gull, is it, pecking a red spot on the mother's beak, and they know to do that because you can hold a red pen there and they'll do it, or something.
Right, and that's the work of Nico Tinbergen, and that's a classic study. Because he did something very clever. He was studying the newly hatched chicks of herring gulls, and when they first hatch out, just seconds, tens of seconds after they hatch out, if they see the beak of an adult herring gull, which is a very distinct shape, it's long, skinny, it's bright sort of yellow, except at the tip where there's a bright red spot at the tip. If they see that, they know instantly to peck at that spot, and they will do that, and that is a way of triggering the adult to regurgitate food. They are soliciting food by doing that. So Tinbergen studied this, and he found that he could trick the birds into this behavior by presenting artificial models of the adult herring gull's bill. And then he could play with that. He could change the shape of it, exaggerate attributes, and he found that if he exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective at eliciting the behavior than a real herring gull's bill. And he coined the term supernormal stimulus for that. That was something that was even more effective than the natural stimulus at eliciting the behavior. And I try to...
Which was innate, and the key is that is innate.
Yes, the behavior is innate. The expectation, the visual model of what the parent looks like, all of that is innate. And so what I have tried to do in my ideas about religion is something very analogous to that. And I suggest that God, the most popular, the most culturally successful formulations of God, meaning a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, who responds to and answers prayer, who is unconditionally loving, those aspects of God are a supernormal stimulus for the innate neural model of a mother. That just as a mother, knows your needs, is able to help your needs, they're able to meet your needs and will respond to your crying. So God not only knows your needs, God knows everything. God is omniscient. God is not only able to meet your needs, God is able to do anything. God is omnipotent. God is not only able to respond to crying, God hears your prayers no matter where you are, even if you pray silently. God always answers your prayers. God always responds.
So these are supernormal stimuli that are sociologically manipulated. Such that, so I think just because Kirk in the chat here has just said, if belief is hardwired, but it's not. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, because I'm probably butchering this, but it's not that belief is hardwired. It's that these particular behaviors which will lead to a belief in God are hardwired, and if you're in a particular environment, then these will be accentuated and emphasized, so it's
yes.
Those particular behaviors.
Yes, I would say that a vulnerability to religious belief is hardwired. That's how I would put it.
I like that. So sorry, I interrupted you. So there are these supernormal stimuli. So what are the other ones? You've mentioned sort of it's these things to do with a maternal side of things, although I remember you being asked a question in a talk where you said, well, where someone asked you, well, what if there was a single parent family where it's a father and not a mother?
Yes.
So are these specifically maternal, or are they just caregiver?
It's really just caregiver. But the thing is, in the natural condition, in the human natural condition, mothers are especially important because they not only give birth, they feed the infant through breastfeeding. And that's something that we now no longer necessarily depend on if we can get formula. It's a little hard to get formula in some places right now, but infant formula can substitute for that, and fathers can substitute for mothers, and so on. And the older the infant gets, obviously, the more important other attachment figures become. But I describe it as an innate model of mother only for that reason, that what evolution is trying to do is to get us to attach to mother in those first critical days after birth.
So what are there any other aspects to that motherness? I mean, there's a great quote, I think. Let me find it. You talk about a mother-shaped vacuum that persists into adulthood. Have we talked about all the different? This is it. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom and not a supernatural spirit.
Right. That's a catchy phrase I came up with based on two metaphors for trying to understand this aspect of religiousness. One is the one we've just been talking about the supernormal stimuli, the sort of the ethological understanding of this infantile aspect of religiousness. The other metaphor comes from neuroscience, and that is the phenomenon of the phantom limb of the amputee. When the brain, we've talked about these innate expectations of things that an organism expects to see, like the herring gull chick expects to see a parent's bill, and it has an innate model in its brain of what that should look like. It's crude, but it's enough to get it started in life. The brain of every organism, as far as I know, that's complicated enough to have a brain and to have limbs and to have a body. Every organism expects to have a body. It expects to have sensations from its body, not just the sense of touch from the skin, but also receptors in the muscles and connective tissue that tell you how your limbs are positioned, how much force is being exerted by your muscles at any moment, basically where your body is and what you're doing with it. And the brain expects that absolutely. It's that really is a critically important thing about human existence, human consciousness. It's sometimes called embodiment, the sense of embodiment, of having a body. And if through amputation, part of your body is removed, the circuitry that deals with that and expects all of that to be there is still present in your brain. And that expectation is so powerful that for most amputees, a large majority of them, they report that they still feel the missing hand after their hand has been amputated, and it's called a phantom hand. And that sensation is so compelling that in many situations, an amputee will reach to answer a phone with their phantom limb or put it out to break a fall, not remembering in that instant that the illusion is only that. It's only an illusion. They're aware that it's an illusion, but it's so compelling they can't get rid of the feeling that the limb is still there. Now this circuitry of embodiment that handles our understanding of our own bodies it's distributed in several parts of the brain. One of the most critical is called the temporoparietal junction. It's the overlapping area between the temporal and parietal lobes. That's what the name means. But it deals with these sensations from the body, but it also deals with visual information that it's taking in about other people's bodies. So when you see someone else moving or doing some behavior, you're comparing that, your brain is in some way comparing that or evaluating that and trying to interpret that by comparing it to what you would be doing with your own body if you were doing that movement. And the neurons that are implicated in this have been best studied in monkeys. and they're called
Is it?
mirror
I was
neurons
just going to
because,
say, is this mirror neurons? But you've just
yeah,
been, yeah.
yes, exactly. That's the phenomenon. They respond not only to a specific behavior that the monkey does, but they respond when they see another monkey doing that behavior.
Which
So
is the
these,
basis, I would argue, is the basis of empathy. And that
yes,
there's an argument that people with damaged mirror neurons are unable to do intersubjectivity, which is to put themselves in someone else's shoes. So if you've got a kid that like throws a pencil in another kid's eye, you're like, why did you do that? Like, surely you know what it feels like to have you can imagine what it feels like to have a pencil thrown in your eye like that child. And they're like, no, I can't do that because I don't have the mirror. Well, they're not saying that, but damaged mirror neurons, or dysfunctional mirror neurons, arguably are an integral part for, you know, a lack of empathy, and therefore arguably lack of morality.
right, exactly. And this is a critical part of human social behavior, interpreting other people, not just what other people are doing with their bodies, but their motivations, what's going on in their minds when they're doing some behavior. And this area in the temporoparietal junction is involved in that. You mentioned using transcranial magnetic stimulation to interfere with moral judgment earlier. There's some fascinating experiments on that. The temporoparietal junction, this area I've been talking about, is the area they targeted to do that.
Right.
So it's also involved in moral judgment, interpreting the morality, the motivation, the intentions of other people as you see them behaving. Now, so the analogy I draw is that there's this very deep link between your interpretation of your own body and the bodies of others. So the phantom limb can be compared, I think, in a meaningful way. It's more than just a metaphor. The illusion of a sensed presence, of feeling the presence of this loving savior out there somewhere, that I think comes from this neonatal circuitry. When that happens in an adult, it often happens in an adult who's in some condition of stress or crisis, or feelings of helplessness, the kinds of feelings that would mimic the helplessness of infancy. And when they feel that, when that gets triggered, they interpret that as the existence of God. They're projecting God into that feeling of a sensed presence. So when I say that that God is not a supernatural spirit, but is a supernormal phantom, what I'm saying is that God is sort of a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense that we were talking about earlier, but God is also, or the presence of God, the feeling of the presence of God, is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense, because there is circuitry in the brain left over from infancy that expects this being to be there, just as the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there.
So in a sense, the brain is both providing the need and then providing the solution.
Yes. It's sort of directing you towards that solution so powerfully that you can very easily conjure up the illusion of the solution right there in front of you.
So in what way is this then? So this is your theory. I mean, is there anything else you want to add to the scaffold of your theory here at all?
I think we've covered the basics of it pretty well already.
So you've already mentioned a little bit about predictability. I don't know the right word there, but any good theory or a better theory is one that also has predictive value. So what does your theory offer in sense of what it can predict?
Well, we've already talked about one area. One is trying to predict what kind of religiousness elite scientists will have based on the hypothesis I've offered, that it comes from this neonatal dimension of religiousness. Another area it makes a prediction has to do with why are women more religious than men? on average, of course, there are many individual exceptions. There's a wide variation, but on average, women are significantly more religious than men by almost every measure of religiousness and in almost every society on Earth. Now, there are some interesting exceptions, but by such measures as frequency of daily prayer, self-rated importance of religion in one's personal life, being affiliated with a formal religion, all of these measures of religiousness are significantly greater in women than men on average. So why is that? And there have been several ideas about this in the literature. There's no scientific consensus on it.
I know that some theories are about empathy, and then this might go back to sort of mirror neurons and might tie in some way. But yeah, there are lots of different theories. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I offer, the suggestion I offer about this, is that it has to do with the greater compassion and empathy, which you just mentioned, in women than in men. You can show that by psychometric tests, that women are more nurturing and caring than men. They spend more time in child rearing activities, and not only spend more time doing it, which is something you can pass off to social things that may be influencing it, but they enjoy it more. They actually prefer doing these tasks more than men do. So women really are more caring and nurturing than men on average. The basis of my explanation for it is that, again, the greater religiousness of women is specific, I predict, to this neonatal kind of religiousness. So I would predict that you would find less of a difference between men and women in religiousness if you only look at belief in a judgmental, cruel, punishing God. But if you look at belief in a nurturing, loving God, you would find you would see a greater sex difference in religiousness. And the critical idea behind it is not just that women are more caring and nurturing, but that we can see in the brain that the areas that handle maternal behavior, maternal nurturing and caring, looking out for infants, or in the case of rat mothers, in retrieving and taking care of their pups, licking, grooming, feeding their rat pups. We can study this in rats better than we can study it in humans. We can do drugs and lesions and all kinds of things we can't do with humans. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap in the circuitry between a mother's response to and caring for its pups and the pups crying out for its mother. There's a lot of common neural circuitry there. So what I'm suggesting is that because there is this common neural circuitry, then there should be a correlation, and that pups who are more enthusiastic, or let's put it this way, mothers who are more enthusiastic about caring for their pups should, as infants, when they were pups, should have been more enthusiastic about crying out for mother when they're separated. And this correlation, if I'm right about the infantile basis of religion, then there should also be a correlation between the intensity of crying out for mother as an infant and the intensity of crying out for God as an adult. So that's the connection, and that's where that prediction comes from.
And has that been found in the data then?
To my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, that has not been examined.
It's not that it hasn't. It's not that there's a null finding or anything. It just hasn't.
No. It just, I don't think it's been looked at. Now, I have seen a few papers where you can sort of see it in the data. They weren't asking that question specifically, but you can sort of see hints of it. But I say only hints because, like I said, they weren't specifically looking for it. And in the context of predictions, I should mention one other thing. In my appendix at the end of the book, I offer a psychometric test. It's a very rough draft of a psychometric test. It needs some work still, but it's a psychometric test that tries to tease apart these two dimensions of religiousness, what I call the neonatal root of religion, which is most of what we've been talking about, and what I call the social root of religion, which is most of what the scientific literature on religion has talked about. and that is concerned with God as a dominant leader, as an alpha male, as an exalted king who is judgmental and cruel and punishing and threatening. Those aspects of God, I think, have to do with human social behavior. And
I wonder if this. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Anyway, I was just going to say that I think you can tease these apart, or you should be able to tease these apart with a psychometric test. And if I'm right about this, if these things, these two dimensions really exist not only in my thinking, in my imagination, but exist in the human brain in the way I suggest they do, then you could do what's called a factor analysis on this psychometric test, using a wide variety of people, having a wide variety of religious backgrounds. And you should see these two groups of items naturally cluster into two separate factors, a neonatal factor and a social factor. And that is a prediction that has not been tested yet. But
so Kirk again said, my theistic beliefs, when I had them, were directed towards a goddess rather than a god for the most part. Now, so this is quite interesting. I don't know if you thought about this in terms of if we are more inclined, or if neonatally we desire a caregiver, which is usually the mother, then would we not expect there to be more sort of inclination towards a goddess figure than a male god figure? I don't know. Is this something you thought about?
Yes, I do talk about that, and it's one of the most fascinating questions, I think. And I often get that question, not from someone like Kirk, who actually has been drawn to a belief similar to what I would predict, but among the great majority of Christians in America, for example, I will often get the objection, well, if what you say is true, then why is God not female? Why is God a male? And my answer to that is that the male side of God, the domineering maleness of God, tends to come from the social root of religion. That's the God of the social root. But there's an interesting point to be made here, and that is that even in religions where the social root dominates, where God is seen as an omnipotent male, a fearsome being who can cast you into hell just as easily as save you into heaven. Even in those religions, the feminine side of God creeps into the religion, whether the powers that be want it there or not. So, for example, in Roman Catholicism, the veneration of the Virgin Mary has sort of spontaneously grown and flowered and taken over a lot of the popular beliefs and rituals of the faithful, whether or not the Pope wanted it to happen. And they see the Virgin Mary. They pray to. They think of the Virgin Mary as someone to whom they can pray for love and nurturance and forgiveness and protection, and for intercession between them and the fearsome male God, the fearsome male Yahweh, who could throw them into hell. Also, another example of this from Catholicism, they do the same thing with saints, who also are supernatural beings in heaven to whom they can pray for intercession. Female saints outnumber male saints in Catholicism 2-1. And you can go down the list of all the religions. You can find examples like this where the feminine side of God just creeps in. Even in Islam, which is one of the most hardcore social root religions we see, and we think of the God there as being very judgmental and punishing. Allah, is very judgmental and punishing. But you can find verses in the Quran that say exactly the opposite, that Allah is the merciful, the all-forgiving, and they will sometimes. I've even seen there's one sentence in the Quran, I don't remember the exact verse, it's cited in my book, where Allah is described as the all-merciful, all-forgiving, deliverer of painful punishment. So you get both biological roots of religion, the neonatal and the social, in one sentence. And apparently they're quite happy with that contradiction, because they have powerful intuitions in their brains that tell them both descriptions of God must be true.
So I was wondering, you can manipulate people in many ways in the lab. So you can give them out-of-body experiences, OBEs, where, by, I don't know what you do to elicit those, but it can be done. And I was wondering, and I know I quite often have chats with another YouTuber called Derek Lambert, and he often talks about a Darren Brown episode. I don't know if you know Darren Brown, the kind of magician, but he does a load of TV shows where he basically manipulates people psychologically into having different experiences and whatnot. And there's one episode where he makes an atheist have a religious experience. And I haven't watched it, but I was wondering whether, just by pulling on those maternal, like all loving, supportive sort of little psychological threads, whether you could manipulate someone into having a religious experience by being knowledgeable of those supernormal stimuli.
That's a fascinating question, and it's something I've put a lot of thought into. There is some, as you say, there's some interesting literature on this subject. The most dramatic examples of out-of-body experiences that I've read are ones that have occurred in epileptic patients who are having electrodes implanted in their brain. This is sometimes done prior to neurosurgery, when the surgeons are going to try to remove the focus of epileptic seizures. And they want to map out the area of the brain around there to know what it is they're going to destroy. What is the patient going to lose when they cut this out? They don't want to do more harm than good. So they will put in an array of microelectrodes that stimulate the cortex. And while the patient is awake and speaking, they can stimulate these areas of the brain locally through these electrodes and see what the patient experiences. And when this is done in the area around the temporoparietal junction, the area we were talking about later that handles embodiment, sometimes you get these out-of-body experiences where the patient will say, I'm floating above my body now, and I can see myself in bed, although I can only see my lower body, but I'm up near the ceiling looking down. What's happening there is that something the electrode is doing is scrambling this normal computation of embodiment and screwing it up in a way that the brain is trying to make sense of it. And the way it makes sense of it is, my head is looking down on my body from an unnatural vantage point. That's the most dramatic example I know of. There's a notorious psychologist named Michael Persinger who claimed to be able to do this.
Didn't he have wasn't he the guy that made the sort of headset?
Yes, he took a motorcycle helmet and put electromagnetic coils all around it, and would provide magnetic fields varying in some complex way, and put the subject in a isolation chamber, a sensory deprivation chamber. So they're sitting in a reclining chair, comfortably relaxed in the dark, can't hear anything. They've got this motorcycle helmet on, can't see anything, and they're just asked to describe what they're experiencing as he tinkers with these magnetic fields. Now, he's done lots of work on this. He died recently. I think he died in 2013 or something like that. I don't remember exactly when, but he did many of these experiments. And what he claimed was that very often these magnetic fields would cause people to have the illusion of a sensed presence, some being nearby, also in the chamber, or interacting with them in some way. But it was usually described in a vague way, that there was just some other being present that he attributes to these magnetic fields. Now, some years ago, I think it was 2006, a Swedish group who also is involved in studying the attachment theory of religion tried to replicate his results, and they collaborated with him. They figured out, they got his design for how to build the helmet and how to make the coils and what current to use and how to vary it and all this stuff. Same software to run the coils, all of it. And they could not replicate his results. They did replicate the phenomenon of people in this chamber reporting a sensed presence. But there was no correlation between that and the magnetic fields that were applied. So they claimed, they concluded that Persinger had not used proper double-blind procedure in his experiments, and that what he was doing was eliciting these experiences mainly through sensory deprivation and suggestion. The Swedish group found, they did some psychometric tests, and they found that subjects who had unusually high suggestibility were the ones who were most likely to report these sense presence illusions. Those two things did correlate significantly, but the magnetic fields and the sense presences did not. So there's another fascinating study that came after that, and I talk about that in my second book. We can maybe talk about that in the next interview. But they concluded, okay, so the magnetic fields don't really work, but this is a great way for getting people to have these sense presence illusions. Let's just do it anyway and tell them that
because it adds to the suggestions,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. Putting them in a university setting or in a hospital setting with all this electronic equipment and the helmet and everything, it just adds to the suggestion, to the power of the suggestion. And so they did experiments like this, and they got the same kind of results. And they said that this is now actually a good model system for studying this. You could do real manipulations and then see how it affects people's sensation of a sense presence. You could, for example, use a real transcranial magnetic stimulation coil to somehow mess with the computation in some part of the brain that you think is relevant, and then put on the helmet and put them in the chamber and see if that makes a difference. And I think that's a fascinating thing. I think there's potential there.
I've interviewed a number of people, and this is a big thing in America in some fundamentalist churches, which is altar calls, where you go up and you take on, I don't know, it's not something we do in the staid Church of England on a Sunday, singing some dirge kind of hymns. We don't do that kind of stuff, but the whole kind of experience, blah blah blah. But all the people I've talked to have said that music and other things are used to manipulate the layperson into basically having a religious experience. You know, it's just and it's not that the pastors are doing this like knowingly that I am going to manipulate this person to having an experience. It's like the music and all of these extra bells and whistles are just what they always do, and they work, but they don't see it as working. It's just part and parcel of the whole package of this experience. But it's actually these things that are helping to generate the religious experience, which kind of fits into that.
Excellent point. And I'd just like to add that since you mentioned that, I actually, in my second book, in the final chapter, I list some testable predictions and experiments that might conceivably be done. And I talk about the idea that I just described of using Persinger's helmet to try to suggest to increase the suggestibility of the environment and induce these experiences. But I also mentioned that you don't even need to do that. You could just examine a bunch of people who are sort of on a spiritual quest, going to different religious services, trying out different religions, and see how much some experimental manipulation, like a drug, affects their susceptibility to religious conversion. In other words, send them to altar calls like the ones you just described. And if you have enough subjects, you might actually be able to see a significant effect of some manipulation that you have some reason to believe should affect the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine if you had an altar call scenario where you didn't have the pastor, being really over emotional and emotive, and you didn't have the music and you didn't have the people clapping and all this kind of stuff, that builds that hysteria, then
Yeah.
you just wouldn't get the conversion rates or the success rates that I mean, it seems pretty obvious. So you talk about as part of your idea of what God does in a functional way in terms of replacing the mother or the caregiver in this attachment scenario. You talk about prayer. Like, I'm interested to see what you have to say about prayer and how that works.
The main point I make about prayer is that prayer should be an astounding puzzle. It should be an astonishing mystery and puzzle, and most people don't see it that way, whether religious or not religious. But the reason it should be an astonishing puzzle is that the people who pray to God for deliverance, for salvation, for curing a loved one who's dying of some serious illness, the reason they do that is because they're trying to change an outcome, to make something happen, to have a miracle. But they're praying to a God that they believe is omniscient and omnipotent. Now, if the God is omniscient, the God already knows about what you're asking for. And if you say, well, I'm just praying to express my gratitude to God, or to express my faith or whatever. But God knows that too. God knows everything. There's nothing God cannot know. So God already knows about the illness, the need, the suffering, whatever it is that you are crying out for. So why pray?
This is right in my ballpark. So in my latest book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design, I've got 2 arguments in there on exactly that, on like prayer doesn't make any sense. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It
does not make any sense. It's astonishing that so many people pray and never think that never see that. And I think the reason they don't see it is for the same reason that they're blind to the contradiction between the all-forgiving Allah, who's the dispenser of painful punishment. It's because of these powerful intuitions that are burned into our cortex. And in this case, it's the powerful intuition from our neonatal circuitry that tells us this being exists, this other being, this primordial savior exists.
Who will answer your calls in despair, right? So this
exactly. And you must cry out. So my conclusion is that adult prayer of this kind, this specific kind of prayers of desperation, are the adult manifestation of infantile crying. That's what I'm suggesting. And that, again, with the proper techniques, could be something that could be tested experimentally.
Well, it seems entirely plausible to myself. You talk, and so earlier on you talked about most popular versions of religion, and you kind of mentioned that as a thing, and it got me thinking as we were talking that I've often said in my talks that that really religion only exists because of the afterlife. Like if religion didn't offer an afterlife, heaven and hell scenario, and a transcendent vehicle of the soul, right? If it didn't offer that, then actually most people probably wouldn't believe in religion, because that's one of the biggest, in my opinion, draws. It not only gives you the biggest reward in human conception of heaven, but also the biggest potential punishment in human conception, which is hell, depending on how you understand those things. Now, how does the after, because you actually spend some time at the end of your book talking about the soul and the afterlife and immortality, how does that fit in with your theory, and what do you have to say to those ideas?
I guess one of the things I would say is that you're right, that the problem of death is the one problem we really have no solution for. If you think of solution meaning not dying, we're all going to die, and we all know it. And so this is the one thing that we can't rely on science to fix for us. Not even science can fix this one, that we're all going to die. And so, well, if you fear this, if this troubles you greatly, as it does some people, what can you do? You can cry. You're helpless in the face of this, and I think it's probably more of a crisis when it's happening in one of your loved ones than it is when it's happening to you. At least it would be for me. But whether it's happening to a loved one or to you, it's something you can't do anything about most of the time, and so you really are desperately helpless, and that's just the condition that would elicit this kind of illusion that I'm talking about. This would trigger that circuitry that says, "Oh, you're in desperate, dire situation here, life-threatening, dire situation here. There exists this other being who can save you, but you must cry out for help. But this being is out there somewhere. Cry out for help." And that's what I think that's why I think the fear of death is one of the most powerful forces behind this. It's not the only one.
No, my theist friend says, interesting, but before you invoke terror management theory, he knows me well. He knows that I would just start talking about terror management theory, which is kind of how you deal with mortality salience and the idea that you're not going to live forever. And I don't want to invoke transhumanism as answering that, and futurism, and the idea that we're working towards living for a lot longer. The bigger issue noted in literature is meaning crisis, not death per se. And actually, you talk about meaning yourself in one of in the 7 causal variables in terms of reasons given for spirituality, the sense of purpose or new meaning to life as a consequence of experience. What would you have to say in terms of meaning?
Well, in the place in the book where I list those 7 things, I have a footnote saying, I guess it's an endnote, where I point out that the feeling of meaning or purpose in life is the one of the 7 that my hypothesis doesn't really address. I don't think the idea of the existence of this nurturing mother figure, I don't think it doesn't really address that. But I do think that people need a sense of purpose and meaning. The only thing I can say about that is that my own way of dealing with that in my own life is just to concentrate less on worrying about the purpose of existence or the purpose of life, and instead on finding purpose in life, finding purpose in my own life, in finding meaning in what I do, devoting my life to solving some problem or alleviating some problem that matters to me and that I think is important. So,
sorry, I just dropped my pencil.
Sure.
Yeah, carry on.
That's basically all I have to say about that.
Yeah, which is to say that I guess that you're not presenting a theory that is explaining everything, but it is a component of all these different theories, and it's a component of the biological set of theories as opposed to the social set of theories, and all of these together give you religion in the broadest sense.
Yes.
But your neonatal theory gives you the basis for why people have a longing for a God presence in their life, among other causal variables.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair.
So as we are ambling towards a conclusion here, if anyone has any questions, any super chats, please do get them in. I hope you've appreciated this chat. It's been fascinating. And actually, this is something I think probably, again, Kirk said earlier on in the conversation, but I was going to bring this in anyway, which is people like Michael Shermer talk about agenticity and patternicity. So the idea that we are predisposed to finding patterns and agency in the world around us, in the environment around us. Is that obviously that's not what your book's about, but obviously these similar things in terms of psychology. I don't know whether I presume they are hardwired things as well. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. And what I would say in response to that is that I agree with that basic idea that humans are agent detecting beings. We're pattern seeking machines. We seek order and regularity. I would only add, and this is more along what I talk about specifically in my book, I would only add that we expect some things rather than others. We perceive some things more easily than others. Our brains are learning machines, but we learn some things more easily than others. Our learning is neither boundless nor aimless. We have constraints on it and guardrails, or whatever, however you want to think of it. And those things come in part from innate sources, and this innate model of the mother is one of those, and it shapes our brains in a way that we are susceptible to belief in these spiritual beings that have certain nurturing, loving qualities.
Brilliant. Yeah. So, these are structures that funnel our learning broadly towards certain ends, though not necessarily. What I'm going to quote your book at page 267, I think. The concept of this is going back to the immortal soul, but I just like this quote. The concept of an immortal soul or spirit predates not only the discoveries of modern neuroscience, but probably all of recorded human history. In part, it is a natural response to our extraordinary intelligence, to our ability to imagine a distant future in which our bodies are dead, and to our inability to imagine the non-existence of the intelligence that is doing the imagining. And I love that, the idea that, there's this inability, we just have an inability to imagine ourselves not existing.
Yes.
It's just like can't compute. And I know we've already talked about that, but is there, and you talked about mind-brain unity, when we could talk about consciousness, and have you got anything to say about sort of that, or about consciousness, about the dependence of the mind on the brain at all?
Only to make the point that that I see the mind and the brain as one. There are two different ways of seeing the same thing. Or as Steven Pinker puts it, the mind is what the brain does. And if the brain is damaged, the mind is damaged. And very often the mind is damaged in a highly predictable way based on what we understand about how different parts of the brain do different things. If you damage the occipital cortex, you're going to have a mind that has trouble seeing, for example, because that's where the visual cortex is. I would say that a century or two of neurological research, not just modern neurobiology, but the research that goes back really a century, studying epilepsy and brain damage, tells us that there is this tight correlation between damage to the mind and damage to the brain and damage to the mind. So I just see it as inescapable that the two are one, and an honest person who's familiar with that literature has a hard time seeing it otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the same can be said about, mind-altering drugs, or even food and drink in any kind of general sense.
Yes, yes.
Tiredness, irritability. Your consciousness, as I often say to people who are like, dualists of that ilk, stick a fork in your eye socket and see what effect that has on your consciousness. I predict it might have a little bit of an effect.
I believe.
Yes, so on and so forth. Well, look, what you've done in this chat is laid out your theory of how we might be susceptible to believing in a God that looks to fulfill some of those maternal functions that we have hardwired into us as neonatal entities. Where are you going to take us in the next chat when we talk about your second book?
Well, remember I said at the beginning that that neuroethology projects tend to come in two phases. There's an ethology part and a neuro part. The ethology part is the behavioral part, understanding the behavior. And my first book has mainly tried to do that part. It is mainly concentrated on the behavioral aspects, the psychological aspects of human religious behavior, especially this sort of neonatal dimension of religious behavior. The second book, which I call The Phantom God, does more of the neuro part. It's in that book, we dive deeply into the brain, and I take you on a tour of the parts of the brain where I think it is most likely that this innate model of the mother is implemented. I look at what those parts of the brain do in an adult, how we know what they do to the extent that we do. Obviously, we don't completely understand any of it, but we do understand a surprising amount about some of it. And so that's what I try to explore in the second book, and try to make a bunch of specific predictions that can only really come from seeing how the brain does this, how there are certain parts of the brain that handle multiple tasks, for example. And so certain behavioral aspects you think should be linked or correlated because of that. So that's what the second book is about.
I love this quote about your first book that I saw on The Thinking Atheist. You gave a talk to The Thinking Atheist on one of his episodes. Jeanette York says, I read this book, your first book. John Wathey has to be one of the most patient, careful, and painstaking of authors. This is a beautiful and important book. It has a permanent place in my library, and I will donate copies to organizations as much as I can. So that's your first book that has your overwhelmingly great reviews there. The Illusion of God's Presence, The Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing. And your new book, which is not yet out. I didn't realize that was not yet out.
Yeah, it comes out in October.
Fantastic. Well, that'll be great timing then for being able to talk about that book in a few weeks' time. Otherwise, people can find out what you do at Wathey Research. Is that right? WatheyResearch.com.
That's correct.
And that will, you can find out about, who you are and, your biography. There's a good bio there. It gives you a good indication of who you are and what you've been up to. Look, thank you so much for today. Is there anything else that you think we've left out? Anything else you want to mention or talk about?
I think we've done a great job of covering it. I just want to say thank you for inviting me on. You're a great interviewer. You've asked great questions. Can't wait for the next session.
Oh, that's really kind of you. Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. And I hope everyone's enjoyed learning about what John has to say in terms of a neonatal theory for why we believe and why we have a belief in a phantom supernatural entity, which is just really just supernormal stimuli writ large, I guess. Thank you so much for the lively conversation that's been going on at the side. John's been completely unaware of it, no doubt, but there have been people talking about stuff, which is what we're here for, to try and stimulate conversation and so that people can learn and get involved. All I would say is that those watching, please do grab John Wathey's book and his new book when it comes out as well. I'm sure you'll be really enlightened. Thank you for all of your support, viewers. Thank you for those who are members of the channel. Some of you are in the chat there who are members, so I really do appreciate that. You can join the channel. It does help me do what I do and be able to devote the time to doing this while my children are no doubt running around discovering their own gods in the back garden or something, goodness knows. No, thank you, John, and thank you, listeners. I did want to ask you my quick fire questions, but I'll leave that to the next interview, which is just like a way of getting to know you a bit better. I'll leave that to the next interview. I heard this question today though, and I'm interested to see what you think, just as a random question for you. What compliment would you most like to hear about yourself? What compliment would you most like to be paid?
Oh goodness,
that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Probably the one you just read is hard to beat. I really enjoy that comment about I don't know, I forget exactly the phrasing, the meticulous or the meticulousness of my explanation, something like that. I do try hard to explain difficult ideas as clearly as I can. So I really appreciated that comment.
Cool. Yeah. I think as a writer and a writer of ideas, I think when you get validated on what you're doing, that's a great compliment, isn't it? Because that's the whole point of you doing that. So that's, you know, we all love validation. But yeah, I just thought it was an interesting question. I like that. Yeah, as ever, guys, question everything, particularly your own minds and yourselves. It's really important. Thanks again to all of the viewers and the channel members. Please like, subscribe, and share, and all that kind of stuff that other YouTubers say. But whatever. And thank you so much, John. Final words.
Thanks again. I just enjoyed it.
Good stuff. Okay, toodle pips, everybody.